Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fifth session in the 8-session series on cannabis, equity, and racial justice. I'm Sarah Michael Gaston with Youth Forward, and this series is hosted by the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, California Urban Partnership, and Youth Forward. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors. The California Endowment, the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, California Wellness Foundation, Liberty Hill Foundation, California Community Foundation, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and the California Department of Healthcare Services. Our goal for this convening is to increase awareness about the need to approach all aspects of cannabis policy and the implementation of Proposition 64 from a lens of racial justice and equity. Today, we will focus on local cannabis tax revenues, how cities are allocating funds, and how you can advocate for better use of funds for community needs. For the most part, local governments are spending their cannabis tax revenue on general government and law enforcement. However, this money should be going to community reinvestment, including youth programs, substance abuse prevention and treatment, environmental restoration, and public health initiatives. In this session, we will share some research findings from a report we published last summer about California's local governments that have instituted local cannabis taxes. Then we will hear from community organizers across the state on their efforts to prioritize local cannabis tax revenues for community reinvestment. I would like to give an overview of state cannabis taxes and local cannabis taxes because there is a difference. Prop 64 set tax state rates on the sale and cultivation of cannabis. As a result, the state is collecting millions of new money annually. Prop 64 also designated how those revenues would be allocated, with revenues going to fund state infrastructure, grant programs, law enforcement, and other functions. In our second session, we talked about those Prop 64 grant programs. And the Prop 64 gave local governments the authority to set their own tax rates on cannabis businesses. Some local governments have chosen to create a local tax on cannabis through placing a measure on the local ballot. Cities and counties are free to spend these new revenues from the cannabis tax however they see fit. In addition, cities and counties are able to place fees on cannabis businesses, and in many cases are using developer agreements to bring additional revenue to the local government. I would like to now introduce our first presenter, Jim Freeman, founder and executive director of the Social Movement Support Lab at the University of Denver. For over 15 years, with his background in law, he has been working in support of communities of color to create systemic change and support the creation of powerful social movements. He is currently working on releasing a new book titled Rich Thanks to Racism: How the Ultra Wealthy Profit from Racial Injustice. Look out for this book this coming April. Jim did a bulk of the analysis and writing on how local governments are spending cannabis tax revenues and will now share with you the findings from the report.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thank you for the plug for the book. I do appreciate it. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. Today, like Sarah was saying, I have the pleasure of talking about a report from Youth Forward and the Public Health Institute that I helped to create called California Cannabis Tax Revenues, a windfall for law enforcement or an opportunity for healing communities. And what we really want to do with the report was really look to see what was actually happening with local cannabis revenues, how they were being used. And in particular, the question we wanted to answer was, are California cities using local cannabis revenue to repair the heavily racialized harm for the war on drugs and invest in youth development, public health, and equity? And really, unfortunately, what we found is, in a word, no, they're not, at least not enough. Instead, local cannabis revenues have been a windfall for police departments and are instead being used to exacerbate racial inequity and open up new fronts in the war on drugs. So before we get into the specifics of what we found, it may be worth contextualizing these dynamics a bit. So when we say that cannabis revenues are growing the size of police departments and the criminal justice system, that's on top of almost incomprehensible growth that they enjoyed over the past few decades. So for example, if we flash back to 1982, California had already built a huge criminal justice system, right? If we adjust for inflation, Californians were spending $12 billion, Californians spent $12 billion that year in sort of today's dollars at the local and state level on police, prosecutors, jails, prisons, probation, and other aspects of the justice system. So by itself, the California criminal justice system at that time employed 128,000 people and 71,000 just by police and sheriff's departments. So this was already a huge, huge system. But nevertheless, California continued to aggressively expand the criminal justice system, due in substantial part to the war on drugs. So by 2015, spending on the criminal justice system had risen by 245% since 1982. And again, that's after adjusting for inflation. So in other words, it more than tripled in size, which produced a $42 billion system employing over 236,000 people. So over 108,000 more people than there were in 1982. And if we look just at police spending, over that time, the money going towards police departments rose by 177%, from 6.3 billion in 1982 to 17.5 billion in 2015, again, adjusting for inflation. So as a result, there were now over 32,000 more police department employees than there were in 1982. So all this is to say, by the time Prop 64 was passed, California already had a dramatically expanded, and I would contend outrageously oversized justice system, which resulted in a far larger role for law enforcement in Californians' lives, including carrying out the mass criminalization and incarceration of many, many more categories of behavior, especially related to poverty, mental illness, homelessness, and perhaps especially drug use. And of course, these investments into the criminalization of drug use and the severe harm and destruction they caused were overwhelmingly directed at communities of color, making this not only an example of systemic racism, but maybe the quintessential example of systemic racism. So given this context, you can see how Proposition 64 represented a significant change in the landscape, right? Rather, on one side, rather than a heavily policed 100% illegal market, all of a sudden, wealthy, predominantly white investors had access to a brand new, legal, and highly lucrative industry. However, to maximize their profitability, they were going to need help to prevail over their competition within the underground economy. Meanwhile, on the other side, you had law enforcement, which faced a post-Prop 64 future in which a significant portion of the rationale for the buildup in their budgets was eliminated, right? And so unless they were able to successfully pivot toward other enforcement activities, they risked being downsized to match their reduced responsibilities. So what we really saw was that corporate cannabis and law enforcement were well matched for a post-Prop 64 partnership, right? So the cannabis industry, they recruited political heavyweights to work for them. They hired major lobbying firms to push localities in the state to increase enforcement activities on the unlicensed industry. And they engaged in a major PR campaign to demonize that sector. And law enforcement, which has so effectively been able to expand the scope of its responsibilities over the past few decades, was more than happy to oblige in committing itself to the next in a long line of tough on crime strategies and continue with its war on drugs. So as cities and counties around the state proceeded to pass and implement the local ordinances needed to tax recreational cannabis, the cannabis industry and law enforcement were in prime position to advance their shared interests. So to better understand what this looks like on the ground, what we did was research those cities that were the first to pass recreational cannabis ordinances related to Prop 64, and that had actually begun to collect cannabis-related revenue by 2018. So what that includes is those cities that passed ordinances in 2016 in anticipation of Prop 64 being approved by voters, as well as those that passed ordinances in 2017. And so ultimately this universe of cities that we studied was 28 cities, some of them very large like LA and Long Beach and San Diego, and some very small ones like Point Arena, Woodlake, and Greenfield. And so the first thing to talk about, the first thing to point out is that we're talking about a lot of money. This is a lot of revenue coming in. Just according to the projections in their city budgets, these cities estimated that they would be bringing in over $85 million from local cannabis taxes in just the 2019-2020 fiscal year. I do want to point out also that this research was done about a year and a half ago, and I haven't looked back at these cities since then, but I would guess that the projections are far higher now because most of them were clearly in the process of ramping up their local industries. So where does this money go to? In nearly all these cities, as Sarah alluded to, it goes into their general fund, where it's used to pay for various city services. However, for most cities, the largest chunk, by far the largest chunk of their general fund spending goes toward the police. So on average for these 28 cities in our study, police spending represented 39% of general fund spending. And for some cities, such as Cloverdale, Modesto, and Woodlake, police spending actually represents the majority of their general fund spending. So unless we make an affirmative effort to direct these new revenues, these new resources elsewhere, revenues such as these cannabis revenues are going to heavily benefit the police. Additionally, what happened is instead of actively seeking to direct these new revenues elsewhere, many jurisdictions are instead explicitly seeking to use cannabis revenues to expand police budgets. So for example, San Diego said that it's decided that the enforcement of marijuana laws and proactively cracking down on illegal operators, in their words, should be prioritized in deploying their cannabis revenues. LA said it's directing millions of dollars per year in cannabis revenues to the police overtime fund, where it's to be used for investigating and enforcing laws relative to illegal cannabis businesses, among other law enforcement functions. And the small city of Woodlake, which only has a city police budget of about $1.5 million and 9 police officers overall, said it's using its cannabis revenues to fund an additional officer, a canine unit, and a patrol vehicle. And some cities have gone even further in targeting cannabis revenues toward the police. So Shasta Lake, for example, they made their ordinance a special tax, which requires approval by 2/3 of voters instead of the typical majority, which is required for a general tax. And that special tax proposal stated that all cannabis tax revenue would be used to provide funding to support law enforcement and code enforcement activities. And that ordinance passed with 79% of the vote, thus creating a new dedicated funding stream for police. So in short, new cannabis revenue has really been a boon for law enforcement. And between 2016, 2017, the year Prop 64 was passed, and 2019-20, 23 of the 28 cities we researched experienced double-digit increases in the amount of general fund dollars going into police budgets. And 8 of the 28 saw their police budgets grow by at least 25%. And overall, the average shift in police budgets for these 28 cities was an increase of 19% over that 3-year period. So that there were now more than 455 million more dollars going into police, 455 more in general fund dollars going into police in 2019-20 than was spent just 3 years earlier. So that's an enormous budgetary shift for such a short period of time, and particularly noteworthy given the long history of similar increases that have been enjoyed by police departments across the state that I referred to earlier. Of course, cannabis revenues by themselves can't account for that $455 million increase, but it's nevertheless clear that cannabis is playing a significant role in the continuing expansion of law enforcement budgets across the state, rather than shifting investment into meeting the critical needs of communities who have been most impacted by the war on drugs. So just as one example of what this has looked like and how transformative this can be for a police department, consider the city of Greenfield, home to about 17,000 people in the Salinas Valley. So prior to the passage of Prop 64, Greenfield's total general fund revenues amounted to less than $7 million annually. In 2019-20, the city projected over 2.6 million just from cannabis revenue. So many city departments in Greenfield saw significant budgetary increases, but their general fund spending on the police department grew by 56% in just 3 years. So as a result, this small city, which had a police department with less than 16 FTEs, full-time employees in 2016, when Prop 64 was in 2017 when Prop 64 was passed, now has 34, over 34 FTEs in the police department. So that's a huge jump. So as a result of this continued infusion of resources into these law enforcement strategies, suffice it to say that California's war on drugs has continued to rage on. For example, while there have been numerous major developments intended to roll back the criminalization of drug use, including Prop 64 and Prop 47 before that, California's criminal justice system is still being flooded with drug arrests. In fact, in 2018, there were more people arrested for drug offenses than there were in 2013, before Prop 47, before Prop 64, right? And while the number of cannabis arrests has dropped, the racial inequity within those arrests has only gotten worse. So again, in 2013, people of color represented 68% of cannabis arrests, but by 2018, that had risen to 75%. And moreover, beyond the 28 cities that we studied and that I mentioned, jurisdictions all across the state are pouring resources into specialized law enforcement units dedicated to cannabis enforcement. So for example, Sacramento created a unit of 15 new officers dedicated to unlicensed cannabis. They work with SWAT teams, they raid suspected unlicensed cannabis growers across the city. And it's a new dedicated unit just for this. And there's many of them around the state. So for example, the Santa Clara County has their marijuana eradication team. San Bernardino County has their marijuana enforcement team. These are often very well staffed, very highly resourced law enforcement units. So just as recreational cannabis has been a major growth industry for business interests, so too has it been for law enforcement. But fortunately, the news isn't all bad. A number of cities and counties have put their new cannabis revenues to far better use than simply augmenting police budgets. So there's a few examples here. Santa Ana is dedicating $3.1 million in cannabis revenues to youth services, including tutoring, internships, youth enrichment programs. Santa Cruz County is investing $350,000 per year in cannabis revenue to the Thrive by 3 program, which seeks to create a robust system of care for children and families in poverty. Monterey County is allocating nearly $1 million, last year allocated nearly $1 million to things like early childhood education intervention, a homeless shelter, whole person care program. Humboldt County uses $400,000 a year in cannabis revenues to fund the Adverse Childhood Experience Collaborative Partnership, which in their words, seeks to address the impact of the intergenerational trauma inflicted by the war on drugs and deep poverty in the Emerald Triangle region. But I will say, as encouraging as they are, they really just represent the tip of the iceberg of what could be achieved if California cities and counties were to invest cannabis revenues appropriately. As we say in the report, this is perhaps a once-in-a-generation opportunity for a new revenue source at the community level that can be a powerful force for public health, for racial justice, for healing the trauma caused by the war on drugs and the mass criminalization system. So I'll pause here and let the real experts who are doing the work on the ground talk about what that looks like. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Jim. It really does highlight how law enforcement is just grabbing that money to continually crack down on marginalized communities, and it's really unacceptable. So I would like to, towards the end of this session, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So please put your questions and reactions in the comment section below the video in YouTube. We will try to get to them and we'd love to hear about them. Next, we will hear from the organizers on the ground. We have Charles Reed and Isaiah Tony with the Oakland Emerald New Deal, Cesar Casamayor with the People's Dispensary Fresno, and Dulce Saavedra with Resilience Orange County. We've asked them to share with you how they are organizing to get their local governments to invest cannabis dollars in communities of color harmed by the war on drugs, and the challenges they are facing with that mission. So let's start with Charles and Isaiah.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Charles Reed from Oakland's Emerald New Deal, which we are seeking to get 100% of the cannabis tax revenues removed from the general fund and placed in the Community Equity Fund that would dispense those funds back into the community through specialized social programs, uplifting programs, empowerment programs. And if I would, oh, go ahead, Isaiah.
Hi, folks. I'm Isaiah Tony. I'm an organizer with In Advance and the Emerald New Deal in Oakland. And Charles is going to present a few slides, and then I'll hop in later.
Okay, and we get that first slide, please. So we see the Emerald New Deal as an act of atonement for our city's complicity in the war on drugs. So we would like to see the marijuana tax funds be reallocated to impacted Oakland communities. We want to invest in youth diversion, and we want to empower our people through policy change. And this would be a significant policy change and will give our people power. To the next one, please. And these are our endorsers. So far, we have already spoken to a number of city council members. We have over 20 community-based organizations who have supported the Emerald New Deal because people know this is what Oakland needs to make change. Slide to the next one, please. So we don't consider the Emerald New Deal as reparations. We look at it as restitution. Restitution for the crimes of the war on drugs. All of those people that you see on that picture right there pay restitution. So why shouldn't the city and the counties and the states and this country pay restitution for the crimes of the war on drugs? Next one. And so we would like to see these funds invested in reentry programs, educational programs that will help our people be armed for, 2020 on and beyond. One of the things that happens is when people come home from prison, digital literacy is one of the most important aspects of them acclimating back into this society. Some of our people don't even know how to use their phones because they've been locked up for so long for marijuana charges. So we would like to see this marijuana money go back into reinvesting our people, rebuilding our people, and reacclimating them. Next one. So these are the reacclimation workshops we would like to see for our people, where they learn these skills and they are able to get a hand up instead of a handout. Next one, please. And of course, our people come home without having a place to stay. And so we would love to see marijuana tax proceeds be invested in transitional and housing assistance programs that lead to permanent housing for our people. Go ahead, Isaiah. I'm gonna pass it off to you now, bro.
Thanks. So, there are examples around the state of good work that's being done to address the harm and the crimes of the war on drugs. In Inglewood, a school that was closed is being transitioned into a facility called the Regenerator to support formerly incarcerated folks. Here in Oakland, we know that there are folks in the reentry community that are just left hanging. Because the city of Oakland is responsible for having arrested folks and disrupted folks' lives, it makes no sense that this cannabis tax money should go to police departments through our general fund and continue to destabilize communities. In Oakland, the first year that we collected cannabis taxes, there were about $14 million raised. Moving forward, the estimate's somewhere around $10 million. And that's money that, instead of going to the general fund, can support folks to come back and to be successful and to slow recidivism rates. Recidivism rates, for folks that are supported when they come home are far lower. Here in Oakland, we understand that part of our work is to address, the power imbalance between, police departments and police unions and folks in communities who actually are under-resourced. So part of our campaign to get this ballot measure passed is about building, political infrastructure in our communities that can stand up for folks in our communities. Back to you, Charles.
Next one, please. And I think we saw that one already. Yes. So there is an organizing strategy in what we do. You can't make change without organizing. So we are developing our storyteller squad. We are redeveloping our website, and our storytelling squad will be people from the community who have been affected, negatively impacted by the war on drugs, to help tell their stories, to help move our city council and our public officials to do what they should do, and that is to make atonement for their complicity in the war on drugs. You can't just say, okay, we're sorry. You have to do something to make change. And I want to thank you guys for it. And this is where we need that government assistance and collaboration. We have to work with our city officials in order to make change. And we need our city officials to work with us, because the people ain't gonna stop. And I want to thank you guys.
Thank you for that presentation, Charles and Isaiah. You really do need to get the community more political power, and so I'm glad you're working on that. And you could see on the slides, you're trying to repurpose abandoned facilities to support system-impacted folks and other, and offer them opportunities and space to learn, grow, and create. And I think that's amazing. Next, I would like to give the floor to Cesar Casamayor at the People's Dispensary.
Yo, peace, everybody. Can y'all hear me good? All right, for sure. So first and foremost, thank you for the opportunity to speak to the people today. Mr. Freeman, I would love to buy your book and continue conversation, because one of the biggest issues that we see is also the role of the nonprofits and how they're going with siding with some of the say-so of city officials that are funded by police. In many ways, we have politicians that are funded by police, and that is very controversial and a little bit scary, because who do we turn to? One of the things that we've been doing here in Fresno, I'll be very brief, is pushing for policy from a perspective of community first. I understand that I am a businessman, but I'm also a community person that came from the Rockefeller drug laws from New York City, and in Fresno, seeing a lot of the young brothers that I work with fall into the trap of survival and doing what they got to do just to feed their babies and so on. The story is already too well known. So one of the things that I feel is very, very important in the organizing that we're doing, and that we've been doing, is pushing for economic development. So in the city of Fresno, there was a measure called Measure A that passed. It has 5 priorities, those priorities being parks, police, safety, homelessness, human trafficking, and infrastructure. Aside from that, there is a 10% of the tax that goes to a community impact fund, or community benefit fund, as it's called. That community impact fund is supposed to address the needs of the community. As we started in this journey into the industry, was from a perspective of community first. So we looked at the taxation. How is that going to be relevant to community? We continue to see that many of the nonprofit organizations, especially those big ones, those big name ones, some who are actually funding these series, are getting funding from some of these big corporate cannabis companies and setting the narrative for what the needs in our community, with very little information from those communities impacted by the war on drugs. And so we need to have a better approach on how we are engaging our community that almost never gets engaged with what they call the yet to reach communities. A lot of times we are seeing that the narrative, the conversation on what are the needs in the community is dictated by a handful of some of these directors and nonprofit folks who have great intentions, the best intentions, but are a little bit detached from the hustle, the grind, the dirty life that many of us have come from or have seen, have lived through, to really have a true understanding of what are the most important needs. We continue to see nonprofits giving, for example, how to start your business, a lot of services. Where is the access to capital? So what we're doing in Fresno as a business and as a community is saying that there is a taxation, we understand that the community needs from this 10% should solely go to economic development. And we're defining that as entrepreneurship, employment, and mental health. And mental health for those entrepreneurs that are coming out of the legacy market, as they say, which is AKA the black market, but coming into an industry. And it doesn't even have to be through cannabis. We see a lot of brothers and sisters doing taco trucks, or families doing small, businesses. We need to support small economic development for those communities that are always dismissed, that are always disenfranchised, that everybody loves to talk about, but when it's time to put the money where your mouth is, it's almost never there. It's always a service type of approach. And so we need to really look at, and that's what we're doing, we're looking at this taxation to make sure that the funding goes to create economic development for those communities, specifically the African-American community here in Fresno, to be able to develop and have our own self-determination. So as you might call it, Mr. Reed, a restitution, we're calling this a small step for reparations, because we have seen for too long the African-American community, especially here in Fresno, be used as a tool to control the narrative of one of the most urgent needs in our communities. And my understanding, and this is me coming from a humble and understanding my history and where I come from, is that if the black man and the black woman ain't doing right in our community, then everything is all wrong. And so I come from that understanding, and I push, and me and my business partner, we push for a model, because we represent that model of being genuine and in contact with community. For example, some of the work that we've been doing here is not just beyond just with the policy from the city level, but also getting a better consensus and building relationships with some of these nonprofits that are in position of influence, that are in position of power, some of these progressive city council members, to push them more into community and give space for people like, for example, Tough Kids Outreach out here, which is a small nonprofit organization barely starting. The brother just came out of jail trying to do something right. Fresno United is another group. You have Kids Under Pressure, my little homie, Opportunities for All. So I say that to say this. We as a community as a whole, everybody that's listening and working in the nonprofit sector, we need to be better at creating spaces for those that don't have a voice to be able to have space to talk about what are the needs in the community. Because we continue to do these surveys, we continue to do these small numbers, like with all respect, 40 numbers on the third session of the webinar, 40 people that did the survey, that's a fraction of the community needs. And understanding that a lot of, which is beautiful, no problem, 82%, I was mentioned in one of the webinars, from the folks that did survey, cater to the LGBTQI youth, 82% of these findings in the surveys. So what about the ones that are gangbanging? What about the ones that are in the hustle, in the grind? What about those? How are those voices being lifted? And so we're looking at it from a perspective as a business and as a community organizer and activist to make sure that there is inclusion. And the only way that we're going to have better inclusion, to make sure that we have our communities space and have to have voice, is by changing the way that we're approaching the conversation and really being more clear on who is funding who and how that funding is happening. Like I mentioned earlier in my conversation, this is the last thing I'll say. There is companies, corporate companies that are coming into our city that are buying, in other ways, some of these big nonprofits to help them with their social equity plan. A lot of these nonprofit organizations might be dealing with health. They don't know nothing about the gangbang life or how to deal with that community. So how are they going to be the voice for that community? And I think this is some of the things, examples that we need to change to strengthen our true sincerity of how we're engaging community and how we're being in community, to really have a best practical approach on how do we use the tax revenue that's coming in from the services that, as I mentioned, from the parks, all that stuff, infrastructure, safety, to create a small pocket, which is just 10% of the 90%, is only 10%, to make sure that there is economic development opportunities, and not just in the service of how to get your business and how to do a program, but we need access to the capital. And that's what we are looking. to be in better relationship with, for example, the chambers of commerce that we have in our cities, those foundations that give the trainings, that give the funding. And I think by doing that as a business, we show that we are not just the model, this is how we do it, but we're also an example of a good, very sincere, very grassroots approach in making sure that we're doing right by community. We as ourselves have our own percentage that we're giving back to community for access to capital to create entrepreneurship businesses, because that's the only way that we're going to be able to have true self-determination and begin a long out conversation about reparations and how that should look like. There's got to be access to capital for brothers and sisters that's in the struggle, that come from that background, to be able to continue to build a prosperous future in the country. So with that, I would love questions, and we keep rocking. Thank you so much once again for the opportunity to speak to the people. Peace, one love.
Thank you so much for that, Cesar. I'm just astonished by the fact that we are asking for like a slice of the money, not a reasonable amount, which, you know, we could probably ask for a lot more, just to, you know, put in our community, right, and, you know, support community needs. And by doing that, we can, you know, improve so much. And by uplifting, you know, the Black and brown communities that you were talking about, we would see less issues with poverty and violence. And it's just it's a major struggle to just even get a small part of the money. So thank you for all the work that you're doing in the Central Valley. It is incredible. I want to remind people to watching to add their questions to the comment section. And last but certainly not least, I would like to turn the mic over to Dulce at Resilience Orange County.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dulce with Resilience Orange County. And first of all, I just want to start it off with giving a big shout out to the Santana youth that I've led and I've just supported in this Invest in Youth campaign. But yeah, I wanted to share a little bit of some of our successes and some of our challenges with this fight too with cannabis. In Santana, we definitely started our fight in like 2016, mostly to do work around narrative, like around like, why is police getting so much money? Like, why is the city being so irresponsible with their finances? Like, why, like pensions and overspending and not like projecting correctly? So we were releasing a lot of this narrative, like youth voices of like, what can this money be done? And a lot of the things that we faced were definitely, there's no money, there's no money, there's no money. So as Jim Freeman was sharing, like the moment like that, like this new money came and became available to communities, like it really did open like the doors for us to imagine like, what can young people do? What can young people have? And in 2018, we also started seeing those monies start coming in Santana. In 2018, we had an amount, we had 9.1 million come in from cannabis revenue. In 2018, we had 9.1. In 2019, we had 7 million. And this past year, we had 10 million. And next year, we're projecting actually 9.6 million. And our young people through these last couple of years have been working really hard. Our first year that we heard that we were going to get this new money, we wanted to work around fighting for a youth department. So our young people wanted to have the city focus, like have a specific focus to look and to address the needs of young people in Santana. We know that Santana is one of the youngest cities in the country. And we know that it's a lot of immigrant families. So we wanted to make sure that the city like was taking into account like the population that made up a lot of Santana. So we started bringing people together to really talk about like, what can this youth department that the city's going to host like look like? We were looking at like cities like New York and like out of like the US, like in Canada. And we're like, this is so cool. Like, how are they focusing and providing so much resources, so much research, so much support? Like, how can we bring that to Santana? But it definitely did not happen. Like, I think one of the challenges was that like, I think the city did not have a grand vision that we did, and they kind of just wanted to do like piecemeal throwing of money. We were asking for half of that cannabis revenue, so it's 9.1, so we wanted half of it, but they only gave us a third, which was still a big win for us. Like 3.1 million was a really big win for us. So we asked for that coordinator. So our first win for in 2018 was to have a youth coordinator to support the city of Santana with researching the needs of young people, connecting and networking like nonprofits, like government agencies, county agencies, to really provide support But yeah, like I think it fell through in the sense that I don't think people took it serious enough, like the need and demand of young people, that it definitely brought additional challenges. The next fiscal year that we started fighting for this money was that we wanted to make sure that that the city was actually getting like a vision and getting the feedback that community needed. I know that Cesar was mentioning like the cities are going out and getting input from community, like, hey, where do you want to see this money go to? And they only get like 15 people. And it's like, that is not the representation of the community. And we've noticed that in Santana, we are geographically divided between like an older white side of Santana and everybody else. So we definitely have been trying to push the city to really like look and research and learn like what is it that young people want. Like our young people right now are actually working, doing research. We have some young folks that have been doing research and talking to the city, talking to Jim Ketty, to Sarah, Michael, to city folks, and asking like, where is this money? Because they did promise this one third of the cannabis revenue, and young people have been demanding and asking like, hey, we wanted to go to youth jobs, we wanted to go to jobs for undocumented people, we wanted to go to mental health, we wanted to go for youth that are falling through the school to prison to deportation pipeline. And the answer that we've received all the time is like, oh well, like we don't really know what the youth really want. And I'm like, what? Like you have youth right here right now, like asking you and demanding you, like how is it that like you're not listening? Right. Like they're here in the middle of like city council. So yeah, so this last like year that we were able to fight was to give the power for this new youth money to go to the youth commission. So we wanted the youth commission that the city hosted, which is also just kind of like a commission that we definitely need to work on. But this commission is made up of young people that are able to give their voice and decide like what it should go to. But we've also faced additional challenges with that, because it's been hard that like I think like departments have been feeding like different ideas and different needs of young people, which is the new like a strategy that we want to take. Like how does the city look into a long-term solution of like what is it that young people need? Because just asking like department Parks and Rec, like, hey, what do you need for young people? Which was like, I need new grass, like let's give you some money. Like I need a new fence post, I need a new basketball court. But I think like the young people know that there is like deeper issues in our communities that need to be addressed with just right. Giving somebody a new piece of grass or a new basketball. Like there's more to it that our community needs. So yeah, we've been pushing really hard right now, like with the research that the youth are providing, to figure out how we can ask the city to create a strategic youth plan where they have a vision for the next 5 years. Right now, this year that COVID hit, a lot of it became like the city pitting community against community. We've been working around like affordable housing, around like investment in youth, and also universal representation for undocumented families. And it's been such a crazy fight, because it's like, okay, we have this cannabis revenue. Does the youth 1/3 want to give it to affordable housing? Yes or no? And it's like, oh my God, like how are we supposed to pick between like for like providing this space for young people to voice what they need and affordable housing? It's like, hey, do y'all want universal representation for undocumented families, or do you want the youth budget? And it's like, oh my God. Right. So it's been really hard, because they don't have a vision. So this year we've been really asking the city to help us create a 5-year strategic plan where we are researching, we're holding forums and asking young people, asking nonprofits, asking people that work with schools, people, just anyone that works with young people to come and share their vision and voice of what they want to see the city invest the cannabis revenue, because it's just been getting swiped under, like it's just been getting swiped by anyone and everyone, because it is just general fund and it's additional fund, and it includes the police. The police have been trying to swipe this budget, because now police, I guess, do community youth work. I don't know, but yeah, so those have been some of the challenges, and we're trying to get ready for this budget fight. Like some of our young folks that gotta check in with Youth Forward have been able to check in with some of the council members and really pushing forward this youth strategic plan. We're gonna get ready for this new budget cycle, but we're definitely trying to figure out like a more sustainable plan. Like Cesar was sharing, like what maybe a ballot initiative. How is it that we can permanently keep this money and not have it shift every fiscal year, because I think different needs come up every fiscal year. But yes, so if anybody follows us on Facebook or Instagram, y'all can stay tuned with the next virtual budget fights that we'll be going into. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dulce, for sharing how Santa Ana youth and adults are working together to ensure that cannabis policy in your city is invested in the well-being of marginalized communities. And I know you work a lot with undocumented folks, so I know that that is a big priority for you, making sure that they get the support they needed. So thank you. I'm happy now to turn the presenter role over to Jim Ketty to share with you how you can develop an organizing strategy to influence the allocation of local cannabis tax revenues in your jurisdiction.
Great, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to go ahead and share a few ideas for our viewers on how to approach an organizing strategy around this theme of local cannabis revenue. So one critical question for y'all first to answer is whether or not your city or county already has a tax in place and is already collecting revenue. And if you have a tax in place already, what I'm recommending is that the first step is to raise awareness. What we're finding is that people often aren't aware that this is going on and that your local government is bringing in new dollars. Secondly, to research how the tax is structured and how it works. And Sarah Michael and I at Youth Forward, we are very happy to assist local groups who are looking to do research. We can do some of that research for you and with you. So please, if this is something you would like to get into, we're happy to assist. Meeting with your local government staff to find out how much revenue is being generated and how those dollars are being spent. Sometimes you can find that information in public documents, but it's certainly always a good idea to meet directly with city or county staff around that. Sharing the information with partners and allies who are committed to youth services, racial justice, and community reinvestment, kind of spreading the word. Again, going back to step one, building some consensus and awareness and coalitions around this. Next slide, please. And then, of course, key to all of this is developing your own proposal for how you believe cannabis revenue should be spent and invested. As you heard earlier from our friends in Oakland and in Fresno and in Orange County, they have done just that. They have developed their own proposals and bringing those proposals forward to elected officials and to government staff. And that's a really critical step here. We have to be clear about what we want, because in the absence of us being clear about what we want, of course, the dollars flow to the status quo. And we have spent a good amount of time talking on this in this session about what that looks like. In addition to advocating for the revenue to be dedicated to your particular purpose, you can also advocate for growth in revenue to be dedicated to your cause. In other words, as your city or county continues to collect more and more money, you could ask for the new money to go toward your cause. The cannabis industry is very profitable and revenues are going up across the state. You could also advocate for your tax to be increased. Okay? Now I'd like to spend a little time on communities that have yet to put a tax in place. And in order to create a new tax, local governments are required by law to place a ballot measure before voters. If you don't have a tax in place, in many ways, you're in an ideal position because you can start right at the beginning and advocate for how that tax should work, right? So similarly with the prior conversation, it's really critical to start off and build a coalition, and definitely including elected folks in your coalition, your local city council member or county supervisor who would be an ally for you in this. When you are headed towards a ballot measure, it's always critical to do some public opinion research and see how your local community would react to a cannabis tax and your plan for how to spend those dollars. Next slide, please. Part of what you want to do with that opinion research is determine whether you want to pursue a general tax or a specific tax. A general tax is one that you're able to pass with voters at a simple majority vote. A specific tax requires a 2/3 vote. Of course, the great advantage to a specific tax is that you're able to dedicate those dollars to a very specific purpose that is set in law. But that's something you have to weigh and think about based on what you're seeing and where voters are at. And then work with your elected officials to place the tax on the local ballot. And of course, there's always the option of doing signature gathering to place it on the ballot through community effort. And at Youth Forward, we recently helped lead a signature gathering campaign around a youth measure. We've also are currently in a conversation with our city council around a tax on a ballot. So, so those are both options. And then of course, mounting a campaign. And on the next slide, what I'd like to show you are just some of the resources you can turn to as you seek to figure this all out. One is, of course, me and Sarah Michael. We're happy to assist you and do research on this. Another is a statewide network called Funding the Next Generation that is dedicated to helping local advocates raise funds, particularly for children and youth services. We work closely with them, given the fact that we are in the youth policy field. And then I also like to lift up Getting It Right from the Start, which is a project of the Public Health Institute, also known as PHI. Getting It Right from the Start actually has model ballot measure language on their website. So that's another place where you can go to find information. Okay, I think we're going to move now to questions and answers. And what we wanted to do is kind of tackle one of the early questions that came up in the comment section on YouTube, which is there a way in which we can see how much revenue our counties are bringing in with cannabis revenue? And as I mentioned earlier, that's certainly something that Sarah and I can help you investigate and research. We'd also, of course, encourage you to meet with, in this case, county staff to determine what's going on with cannabis revenue. Often online, you can find that material on a city or county website, although it's typically from the prior year. But we're happy to be of support in that area. There's another question here. Is there logic for tax revenue going to police because police have been quote unquote defunded for the past few years? As I think you saw in the presentation that Jim Freeman did, we have seen a steady escalation in police funding over the last number of years. So I'm not really sure where in California you would find police departments having been defunded. If you'd like to take a closer look at the report that Jim presented, you can find that on the Youth Forward website. And we're happy again to follow up with you on that. Does anyone have an example of a local jurisdiction that has already reallocated some or all of their cannabis tax revenues from the general fund to more specific use, like reentry? So you did hear some examples. Fresno's headed in that direction once it starts to collect revenue. Santana's has made some progress there. We have some examples listed in the report. Okay. So for the sake of time, I know that we're just coming up on the hour now. I'm going to turn this back over to Sarah Michael.
Thanks, Jim. So thank you everyone for tuning in and engaging with us on this topic. We hope you received some valuable insight from the report and local organizers about local cannabis tax revenues. Thank you again to Jim Freeman and our panelists for sharing their research and work with us on cannabis equity and racial justice. As Jim Keddy was saying, we are more than glad to help you do some of that research on your local cannabis tax revenues and where that's going. So we can do that. The session has been recorded and we're placed on the YouTube channels of the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color, as well as Youth Forward. Within a couple of days, we will be emailing everyone who has registered for the session, the link to the recording and the slides. And before I close, I'd like to call your attention to our upcoming sessions. We have 3 more. And so, we would love for you to attend these last ones. We have public health coming up in, regulations to protect young people, and then coalition building, and then advancing healing centered and trauma-informed approaches, in this work. And so that's all we have for you today, and want to wish you all a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.